Imagine a world where stealing a loaf of bread could earn you a death sentence. Where entire villages were wiped out for failing to meet robber quotas. Where the color of your skin determined your fate. This was the reality of colonial Africa. For centuries, European powers carved up the continent, exploiting its resources and its people with shocking impunity. Many of these crimes remain unacknowledged, unpunished, and largely forgotten. This is a story of systematic brutality, of lives lost and future stolen, a story that demands to be told. Before the 19th century, European presence in Africa was limited, primarily confined to coastal trading posts. Then came the scramble for Africa, a frenzied period of land grabbing fueled by economic greed, political rivalry, and a self-proclaimed civilizing mission. The Berlin Conference of 1884–85 formalized this process, with European powers carving up the continent like a cake without a single African representative at the table. Perhaps the most infamous example of colonial brutality is the Congo Free State, personally ruled by King Leopold II of Belgium from 1885 to 1908. Leopold's insatiable hunger for rubber transformed the Congo into a vast forced labor camp. Villages were given impossible quotas, and those who failed to meet them faced horrific consequences. Hands were severed as proof of punishment, families were held hostage, and entire communities were massacred. Historians estimate that millions perished under Leopold's brutal regime. The atrocities were eventually exposed by missionaries and journalists like Roger Casement and E.D. Morel, leading to international condemnation and the Belgian government's annexation of the Congo in 1908. But the damage was done. In German Southwest Africa, now Namibia, the Herero and Nomor people suffered a similar fate. In 1904, the Herero rose up against German colonial rule, triggering a brutal response. General Lothar von Trotha issued an extermination order, driving the Herero into the arid Omahik Desert. Thousands died of thirst and starvation. Those who survived were forced into concentration camps, where they faced further abuse and death. The Nomor people, led by Hendrik Witbooi, also resisted, but were ultimately defeated. The Herero and Nomor genocide is widely recognized as the first genocide of the 20th century, a chilling precursor to the horrors that would follow. British colonialism, while often portrayed as more benevolent than its counterparts, was also built on exploitation and violence. In Kenya, the Mau Mau uprising of the 1950s was met with a brutal crackdown, including the mass detention and torture of thousands of Kenyans. Jomo Kenyatta, a leading figure in the independence movement, was arrested and imprisoned. Even after independence, the legacy of British colonial rule continued to shape Kenya's political and economic landscape. France controlled vast swathes of West, North, and Central Africa, employing a system of direct rule and forced labor. The indigenate, a set of laws specific to colonized populations, allowed colonial officials to punish Africans without due process. Ordinary activities like traveling without a permit or failing to pay taxes could result in imprisonment or forced labor. The Algerian War of Independence was marked by extreme violence on both sides, including the Sétif and Guelma massacres of 1945, in which French forces killed thousands of Algerian civilians. Portugal clung to its African colonies longer than any other European power, maintaining a system of forced labor and racial discrimination until the 1970s. In Angola and Mozambique, Africans were forced to work on plantations and in mines under brutal conditions. The anti-colonial wars that erupted in the 1960s and 70s were met with fierce repression. Italy's colonial ventures in Africa were short-lived but no less brutal. In Libya, the Italian army used concentration camps and mass executions to suppress resistance. In Ethiopia, the Italian invasion of 1935 was marked by the use of poison gas and the massacre of civilians. The Addis Ababa massacre of 1937, following an attempted assassination of Viceroy Rodolfo Graziani, resulted in the deaths of thousands of Ethiopians. Colonialism did not simply punish serious crimes, it criminalized everyday life. Actions like traveling without permits, missing tax payments, refusing labor, grazing animals in restricted areas, or even failing to salute colonial officials could result in severe punishment. This system of control was designed to suppress dissent and maintain European dominance. Contrary to the myth that Europeans brought law and order to Africa, many African societies had functioning justice systems before colonial rule. These systems varied widely, from compensation-based justice to systems based on kings, councils, elders, or religious courts. The colonial powers often ignored or dismantled these existing systems, replacing them with their own legal frameworks. Colonial prisons expanded massively during this era. While some African regions had few prisons before colonial rule, the colonial powers introduced prisons, detention camps, labor camps, and native reserves as control zones. The detention system during the Mau Mau emergency in Kenya became one of the largest colonial incarceration systems in Africa. Colonial violence was not always chaotic or arbitrary, it was often bureaucratic and systematic. Atrocities were ordered, recorded, and budgeted, tied to labor targets and tax collection, and justified by legal decrees. This systematic nature of violence highlights the calculated and deliberate nature of colonial oppression. Africans resisted colonial rule in various ways, including armed uprisings, sabotage, tax refusal, desertion, migration, labor strikes, and preserving their language, religion, and customary law. Anti-colonial press and Pan-African organizing also played a crucial role in challenging colonial power. The impact of colonial conquest on Africa was devastating. Direct killing, starvation, epidemic spread, labor exhaustion, family separation, low birth rates, and population displacement led to demographic catastrophe. In many places, the population damage was not just immediate but intergenerational. Colonial systems were designed to extract resources such as rubber, minerals, palm oil, cocoa, cotton, groundnuts, and ivory. This extraction redirected African economies away from local development and toward imperial supply chains. The seizure of fertile land, grazing land, water access, and mineral-rich zones created settler economies and long-term inequality in regions like Kenya, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Algeria, Namibia, Angola, and Mozambique. The legacy of colonial crime continues to haunt Africa today. The borders drawn by European powers have led to ethnic conflict and political instability. The economic exploitation of the colonial era has left many African countries impoverished and dependent on foreign aid. The psychological impact of colonialism, including the erosion of cultural identity and the internalization of racist beliefs, is still felt deeply. The crimes of colonial Africa were not simply isolated incidents of abuse, they were systemic and widespread violations of human rights. These crimes were often sanctioned by governments and justified by racist ideologies. They resulted in the deaths of millions of Africans and the destruction of countless communities. It is time to acknowledge these crimes, to hold the perpetrators accountable, and to work towards a future where such atrocities never happen again. What do you think should be done to address the legacy of colonial crime in Africa?